All right, chapter 2 from The Veil of Isis by Pierre Hadot, translated by Michael Chase. This is also part 2. Part 2 is called The Veil of Nature. Part 1 was called The Veil of Death. So we're on The Veil of Nature now, and chapter 2 is entitled From Physis to Nature. I have said that to write the history of thought is to write the history of misunderstandings. Indeed, when Heraclitus' aphorism was cited for the first time in Greek literature, and we have to wait almost 5 centuries for this to happen, it was given a completely different meaning from the one that I have proposed. It now meant nature loves to hide. This interpretation can be explained by 2 considerations. First, the meaning of the word physis had evolved considerably. Second, the idea of a secret of nature had developed in the meantime, and the aphorism was naturally interpreted in this perspective. Again, the notion of a secret of nature might be evidence for the interpretation of Heraclitus' aphorism that was already being given in the schools, although we have no trace of this interpretation before Philo of Alexandria, around the beginning of the Christian era. It will not be possible to write the detailed history of this interpretation, but I shall concentrate above all on showing how the word physis, which first designated a process of growth, finally came to signify a kind of personified ideal. Initially, as we already glimpsed with regard to Heraclitus, physis designated either the action expressed by the verb phyestai, to be born, to increase, to grow, or its result. The primitive image evoked by this word seems to me to be that of vegetal growth. It is simultaneously the shoot that grows and the shoot that has finished growing. The fundamental image expressed in this word is thus that of a springing forth of things, an appearance or manifestation of things that result from this spontaneity. Gradually, however, a power was imagined that produces this manifestation. In this chapter, I propose to study only this unexpected passage from physis as a process to physis personified. I will then provide specifics about the evolution of the notion of nature throughout the various periods of its history as our story proceeds. From relative to absolute use. In its first usage, which occurs in the 8th century BCE in the Odyssey, the word physis designates the result of growth. In order that he may recognize and use it against the sorceries of Circe, Hermes shows Odysseus the aspect, physin, black root and white flower of the herb of life, which the gods, he says, called molu. This aspect is the particular, definite form that results from a process of natural development. In its first uses, the word physis is usually accompanied by a genitive. It is the birth of or the aspect of becoming. In other words, the notion is always referred to a general or particular reality. As we have seen, Empedocles spoke of the nature physis of things, while for his part Parmenides spoke of the birth of the ether. You will know the birth physis of nature, and of all the signs that are in the ether, and the splendid works of the shining sun, and their origin, and the vagabond works of the round-eyed moon, and their origin, physin. In the Hippocratic treatises on medicine, which date from the 5th century BCE, the word often corresponds to the physical constitution proper to a patient, or to what results from his or her birth. This meaning gradually widened in these same treatises to include the peculiar characteristics of a being, or its primary and original and therefore normal way of being. What it is by birth, what is congenital to it, or again the way in which an organ is constituted, or finally the organism that results from growth. In Plato and Aristotle, physis with the genitive eventually comes to mean what we call a thing's nature or its essence. Sometimes the word was even emptied of all its contents and reduced to a periphrastic meaning. In Plato, for instance, physis aperu became equivalent to aperon, the infinite. Especially from the 5th century on, in the sophistic movement, the Hippocratic movement, and then in Plato and Aristotle, we begin to see absolute uses of the word physis. Here, physis is no longer the form of something, but designates the process of formation or its result, taken in general and in an abstract way. In the 6th century, we also find such uses in Heraclitus, among others, but their meaning is not very clear. At the outset of his work, Heraclitus defines his method as a division of each reality, kata, i.e., according to Thusen. It certainly seems that we have to do here either with the process of realization of each reality or else with its result. The method consists in discerning the coincidence of contraries that reside within it. Nor can we be absolutely sure whether in fragment 123, of which I have already spoken, the birth or appearing that is opposed to disappearing is considered in general or else in relation to some determinate thing. This generalization and abstraction of the word physis was carried out when the need arose to designate the subject of philosophers' research prior to the sophistic and Socratic movements. For instance, the Hippocratic treatise titled On Ancient Medicine, probably written near the end of the 5th century BCE, attacks doctors who let themselves be influenced by these philosophers. Some doctors and scientists declare that it is not possible to know medicine if one does not know what mankind is, and the discourse of these people tends toward philosophy, like Empedocles or others who, with regard to physis, wrote about what man is by going back to the origin, how he was formed in the beginning, and from what elements he was coagulated. I, however, consider that all that has been said or written on nature, peri physeos, by some scholar or doctor is less relevant to the art of medicine than to the art of painting, and I consider that the only source of precise knowledge on nature is medicine, and we can acquire this knowledge when we embrace medicine itself correctly in its totality. I mean that historia, or investigation that consists in knowing what man is, the causes of his formation, and all the rest with precision. The continuation of this text shows that one cannot know the nature of mankind without the precise observation of the effects produced on human nature by food and exercise. The author of the treatise is thus opposed to those who wish to base medicine on the general and global theory of man, replaced within the overall process of nature and inspired by what is nowadays called the philosophy of the pre-Socratics. The word nature, here taken absolutely, designates, as we can see from the context, not the whole of the universe, but rather the natural process, or the working of things in general, the relation between cause and effect, or the analysis of causality. Therefore, when the author of the treatise says that Empedocles and others have written peri physeos, this does not mean on the subject of universal nature, but signifies rather on the subject of the overall constitution. Understanding constitution in both an active and a passive sense as the process by which particular things are born, grow, and die, and have their own constitution by virtue of this process. This notion of constitution is less an object, or a domain of the real, than a methodological program. To study it means to study the genesis of a given particular thing and to seek to examine precisely its causes, or the determinate processes that explain its genesis. Aristotle was to take up this method, modifying the notion of physis, which he refused to identify with a purely material process, yet he describes it in these terms. The best method should be, in this field as in others, to see things being born and growing. This was to become one of the methods of approaching the secrets of nature. However, the author of the treatise on ancient medicine objects that such an approach is not an art of medicine, but an art of painting, graphike. He is probably alluding here to Empedocles, who used the analogy of mixing colors to explain the formation of mortal beings from the four elements. From this perspective, medicine is no longer an art of exactitude, but an art of more or less. Plato. In Plato, too, the word physis is used absolutely to designate the subject of the pre-Socratics research. The Socrates of the Phaedo, 96a7, admits that at one time in his life he had an extraordinary passion for the kind of knowledge called investigations on nature, to which he attributes a program wholly analogous to that found in the treatise on ancient medicine. To know the causes of each thing, to know why each one comes into existence, why it perishes, and why it exists. Yet Socrates informs us of his disappointment. This investigation on nature proposed only a strict material explanation. If he is sitting at this moment in his prison, it is because of the physical necessity represented by the material constitution of his body. Yet it is not rather because of the moral necessity that forces him to choose what he considers to be the Yet is it not rather because of the moral necessity that forces him to choose what he considers to be the best course of action? That is the real cause, of which mechanical necessity is only the condition. In Book 10 of the Laws, we find an allusion to people who have devoted themselves to investigations on nature. They oppose what is produced by spontaneous growth, husai. For instance, fire, water, earth, and air, to what is produced by art, that is, by intelligent activity, 889b2. They are utterly wrong, says Plato, because when they defined spontaneous growth, physis, as the birth that pertains to primary beings, 892c2, they considered that this primary birth, or physis, corresponded to the material elements, such as fire, air, water, and earth. In other words, they considered material causes to be the primary causes of the growth of the universe. Instead, Plato continues, what is most ancient and original is the soul, because it is the movement that moves itself, and is therefore prior to all other movements. The material elements are merely posterior. For those who have concerned themselves with investigations on nature, nature is merely a blind, spontaneous process, whereas for Plato, the principle of things is an intelligent force, the soul. If Book 10 of the Laws opposes nature to the soul, Plato's dialogue, The Sophist, explains the soul's primacy over the elements. Plato reproaches philosophers who have carried out investigations on physis for thinking that this physis, that is, the process of development that engenders things, produces its effects by spontaneous causation and without reflection. They therefore distinguish natural activity, which takes place without the intervention of thought, from artistic and technical activity, which presupposes a program elaborated by an intelligence. Taking up this distinction, Plato opposes his conception of nature to that of his adversaries. For him, physis is precisely an art as well, but one that is divine. I would suppose that the works said to be of nature are the work of a divine art, and those that men compose with them are the work of a human art. This representation was fundamentally important in the Western tradition, both philosophical and artistic. Thinkers often return to the idea that nature's action must be conceived on the model of the production of a work of art. Empedocles had already used metaphors of craft with regard to the demiurgic work of Aphrodite, painting, assembling by means of pegs, ceramics, and gluing. Plato's Timaeus alludes to modeling in wax, ceramics, painting, the processes of smelting and mixing alloys, and construction techniques. Above all, divine art is represented mythically by the figure of the demiurge, who acts on the world from without. For Aristotle, whom we will soon consider, nature acts like a molder. It raises a solid frame around which it carries out its molding. It also proceeds like a painter, drawing a sketch before applying the colors. In this book, we will often encounter this crucial theme of the opposition and subsequent reunification of art and nature, where human art is ultimately a mere special case of the original and fundamental art of nature. If, moreover, physis is a divine art to Plato, there can never be a genuine science for two reasons. On the one hand, natural processes are the result of operations that are known only to the gods. On the other, these processes are in perpetual transformation. They belong to the order of events, or of becoming. They are not eternal like the idea of justice or truth. Aristotle. Aristotle also accepts the existence of an analogy between nature and art, but he adds radical oppositions to it. In the first place, he defines nature as a principle of inner notion inside each thing. Each concrete individual has within it a concrete nature that is proper to its species and is the principle of its natural motion. Not only living beings, but also the elements thus have within them a nature or an immanent principle of movement. Fire, for instance, wants to reach its natural place, which is up above. Water, its natural place, which is down below. In living things, this principle of immanent motion is also a principle of growth. At first, one might think that Aristotle conceives of natural processes on the model of artistic processes. In a work of art, there is first a matter that must be modeled and formed. In a natural process, there is a matter that also needs to be formed. In a work of art, there is in addition a form that is thought by the artist. which he seeks to give to the matter. In a natural process, there is also a form that is imposed upon the matter, and it is the goal toward which the process is directed. In fact, however, differences rapidly appear. In the realization of a work of art, a foreign agent externally introduces form into a matter that is foreign to it. In a natural process, the form shapes a matter that is proper to it immediately and from within. Human art has an external finality. Medical treatment has as at its goal not medical treatment, but health. Nature, by contrast, has an internal finality. The process of nature has no other end than nature itself. It becomes what it wants to become, that is, what it already virtually was. The craftsman reasons as he acts, analyzing the operations that will be needed to make the form that is in his mind appear in the matter. I'll read that again. The craftsman reasons as he acts, analyzing the operations that will be needed to make the form that is in his mind appear in the matter. Nature does not reason, and its operation is at one with the work itself. Art is imposed upon matter with violence, whereas nature models matter easily and without effort. Ultimately, shouldn't we say that nature is a more perfect art since it is inside the thing itself and is immanent and immediate? This problem was to dominate the entire history of the notion of nature. It was formulated clearly in the Renaissance, for instance, by Marsilio Ficino, who wrote, "What is human art? A particular nature operating on matter from without. What is nature? An art that gives form to matter from within." The maxims of nature. If nature is an art within things, it is in some sense an innate and instinctive knowledge. Such an idea was sketched as early as the 5th century, for instance, in Epicharmus, who speaks of the chicken's instinct and of nature as instructing herself. He even phrases his thought as follows: all that is alive is intelligent. We encounter the same idea in the Corpus Hippocraticum, where the instinctive inventions of nature are mentioned. The nature in question in these texts is probably not universal nature, but individual nature, the proper constitution of animals or of mankind. With Aristotle, a new stage is reached insofar as he uses phrases that seem to define a certain constant behavior of nature as an art and knowledge within things. The general principle runs as follows: God and nature do nothing in vain. Nature acts like a wise craftsman or artist who, as Aristotle says in many passages of his studies on animals, proceeds in a rational way, wastes nothing, knows how to avoid the too much and the not enough, knows how to make one organ serve several different ends, compensates for excess with deficiency, tries to carry out what is best according to circumstances, and strives to realize the most complete series of realities. This idea of a method proper to nature was to play a very important role in the scientific representations of all Western thought. Kant would call these principles maxims of the faculty of judgment. It was on the model of these maxims that late writers, beginning with the 1st century CE, understood Heraclitus's aphorism as a description of nature's behavior, which consists in wanting to hide, concealing itself, or wrapping itself up in veils. The Stoics. The Stoics, for their part, returned to pre-Socratic positions, insofar as they made a material element the principle of the genesis of all things. Like Aristotle, however, they located this principle of motion inside each thing and within the totality of things. Nature's operation is thus completely analogous to that of the art within physis. The Stoics defined physis as an artistic fire that proceeds systematically and methodically to engender all things. The original fire gradually condenses into air, water, and earth, only to be set aflame once again after passing through the contrary phases. The world therefore has two aspects: the world taken in its formative and original aspect, and the world taken in the succession of its various states and its periodic becoming. According to its first aspect, the world is identified with the physis that produces and organizes it, and physis itself is identified with the world's soul, that is, with Zeus, or the supreme god. Before the process has been set in motion, physis, nature, God, providence, and divine reason are identical, and God is alone. Once the cosmic process is deployed, nature sinks into matter to form and direct bodies and their interactions from within. As Seneca said, what is nature other than God himself and the divine reason that is immanent in the world as a whole and all its parts? At the beginning of his natural history, Pliny the Elder also clearly marks the appearance of this divinized nature, which was long to reign over the minds of Western man. The world, or that whole that people have been pleased to call by another name, the heavens, whose vault covers the life of the entire universe, must be held to be eternal and immense, a divinity. It has not come into being, nor will it ever end. To scrutinize what is outside it has little importance for man, and escapes the conjectures of the human mind. The world is sacred, eternal, immense, wholly present within all things, or rather, it is the all, infinite while it seems finite, determinate in all things while appearing indeterminate, embracing all things within and without in itself. It is both the work of the nature of things and the nature of things itself. Here the word phusis, which primitively signified an event, process, or the realization of a thing, has come to mean the invisible power that realizes this event. We here encounter a phenomenon that historians of religion have carefully analyzed: passage from the experience of an event to the recognition of a power or force intimately linked to this event. The personification of nature. Identified with Zeus by the Stoics, nature was often conceived, beginning in the first century BCE, as a goddess, who could be invoked with the words of Pliny, "Hail, nature, mother of all things." Later on, beginning with the second century of our era, hymns to nature began to be composed. Macedomes, a freedman of the Emperor Hadrian, wrote one that begins, "Principle and origin of all things, ancient mother of the world, night, darkness, and silence." A bit later, we find this invocation in Marcus Aurelius: "All is fruit from me of what your seasons produce, O nature. From you, in you, for you are all things." We might also cite the first verses of an Orphic hymn to nature, which can also be dated approximately to the second century of our era. O nature, mother goddess of all things, mother of innumerable ruses, heavenly, ancient, fecund divinity, queen, who tames all and is never tamed, who governs all and sees all. A funerary inscription found at Salamis in Cyprus reproaches nature for having caused the deceased to die young. O cruel nature, why then do you produce, you who destroy so quickly? Here we encounter the Heraclitean theme of death as linked to birth, which was often taken up by poets throughout the ages. In the poet Claudian, writing at the end of antiquity, it is clearly Mother Nature, natura parens, that, as Ovid had hinted, puts an end to the battle among the elements. She laments before Zeus on the misfortunes of mankind. As guardian of the entrance, she is seated in front of the cave of an old man, Aeon. She is extremely old, yet her face is beautiful. As Ernst Robert Curtius has shown, Claudian's goddess nature was to live on in the Middle Ages, particularly in the poems of Bernard Sylvester and Alain Delille. Throughout this book, we shall see that under very diverse forms, the personification and the deification of nature continue to remain very much alive down to the 19th century. One could put together a most interesting collection of hymns to nature throughout the ages.